Okay, Mr. Robinger, it's great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, my first question is, I want to ask you how the global financial institutions, like including G20, are successful in dealing with financial crisis starting in 2008. In some sense, there are a lot of efforts by this setup because there are macroeconomic coordination, and it is estimated that fiscal stimulus is about the 15 trillion US dollars, and including the monetary policy, whether it's a conventional or unconventional, they say that it's about 5 trillion dealing into this world economy. But it doesn't seem to generate a very good recovery out of it. So I would like to ask your opinion why this kind of cooperation is not working, and what's the issue, and how would you evaluate it?
Okay. Well, clearly the global financial crisis has led to a very weak recovery, a very disappointingly weak recovery. I think there's no question that while the actions of global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and international organizations like the G20, their actions were not perfect, but there is no doubt that their response to the global financial crisis helped mitigate the economic damage. And there have been important efforts to learn some lessons from the crisis, to reform these institutions, to make them more reflective of the global economy as it exists today. So it's been very important to take the Financial Stability Board or the Basel Committee or the IMF to increase the influence of emerging markets and fast-growing developing economies. That's been very important, but not enough progress has been made, and it's for these institutions to continue to be viewed as legitimate, and for these institutions to be effective. Their governance needs to reflect the global economy of today, not 1950, and particularly it's time that the process for selecting leaders of these institutions be based more on merit and not simply on nationality.
I see. Well, since you mentioned FSB and IMF reform, I think those are two key things has made change since the 2008. I think, could you give me some more details about, the creation of FSB, and how would you like to evaluate the creation and how it's going to work in global financial system?
Yeah, so I think the FSB is a good example where in 2009, its membership was expanded to include all of the major economies, particularly emerging market economies like China. Global capital now can move around the globe so quickly and take advantages of differences in regulation that the global financial system is only as strong as its weakest link. So when we are designing reforms to financial regulations, it's very important that all major economies are at the table in the design of those reforms, such as the new capital requirements, the Basel III capital requirements.
Okay. My next question is about the IMF quota reform.
Yeah.
I think that's very important. I mean, that's very important topic for emerging economies, including Korea. And I say that G20 was already committed to reform IMF quota, but still it's not happening. And I heard that it's not been endorsed by U.S. Congress. So what's going on, and what kind of prospects for this kind of quota reform?
Yes, so I agree that this is very important. The IMF was criticized sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons, for its actions during the Asian financial crisis. But I think one reason why the IMF was so criticized so heavily because of its actions during the Asian financial crisis is because it was viewed by Asians in emerging markets as being an institution that was dominated by Europeans and Americans. And so for the IMF to be effective, it has to be viewed as being governed by all major economies. And there were very important decisions to transfer more votes from advanced economies to some of the fastest growing emerging markets. But you're right that it's been disappointing that some important countries, including the U.S., have not yet gotten legislative approval for those changes. I am not optimistic given the fractured environment in the U.S. Congress that reform will be approved anytime soon.
Oh.
That's why I think it's very important that not only emerging markets get a bigger share of the votes in the IMF, but that leadership of the IMF, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other international financial institutions be based on merit and not be seen as the property of the US and Europe and Japan.
In that sense, I would like to ask you evaluation of G20 as an institution. Like you said that even though G20 committed something, it's not easily to go through member countries internally. And secondly, although it's expanded from G7 to G20, still some people from other countries would say that it's not the fully representation of world economy. So kind of legitimacy issue and kind of leadership issue. How would you like to evaluate it, and what's kind of view on this?
Yeah, so first, it was very important that leadership on global economic issues transferred from the G7 to the G20. The G7 had lost its global legitimacy. G7 still plays an important role on issues that are confined to the G7 countries, but the G7 can no longer be seen as speaking or acting on behalf of the global economy. So it was very important to move away from the G7. The G20 existed. There was a G22 that was established during the Asian financial crisis. I'm not surprised that the G20 then took over from the G7. But the problem with the G20 is there are still too many members. It's too difficult to get a consensus among 20 organizations. There's actually more than 20 members of the G20 once you include the IMF and the World Bank and the ECB and a bunch of other European institutions. I'm not optimistic in the near term that we will make progress coming up with a smaller group. So I think we will have to focus on how to make the G20 a more effective body.
I see. I think to make this institutional, strengthen this institution, Korean government, I think, is they once, once they proposed to making a official secretariat for G20 to institutionalize this system. What's your opinion on this kind of idea?
I think that there are enough international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the Financial Stability Board, Basel Committee, that have staff that can help prepare the work of the G20. I think the important role of the G20 is to provide a forum where the major economic powers, and not some international civil servants, but the major political powers can get together and try to reach consensus on important issues. So I would not support creating a permanent secretariat.
Okay. The next question related to the recent G20 result, saying that they kind of endorsing Japanese currency policy. And I'm kind of interesting because for U.S. perspective, as one side, by the Congress report saying that Japan is currency manipulating country, and on their side, on G20 side, U.S. is kind of agree on the Japanese the foreign exchange policy to be internally, domestically oriented, nothing to do with currency manipulation. So I just want to hear from the ex-finance ministry.
So being an ex-Treasury employee, I'm somewhat amused by the debate. The G7 seems to be saying that expansion of central bank balance sheets is okay if it's done through the purchase of domestic assets, and many kinds of domestic assets.
You're talking about unconventional monetary.
Yeah, so the Fed, ECB, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, it's okay to expand balance sheets, but only by buying domestic assets, not by buying foreign assets. The response from Korea and China seems to be, it's okay if emerging markets like Korea and China expand their balance sheet by purchasing foreign assets, but it's not okay for advanced economies to expand their balance sheet by purchasing domestic assets. I think the real issue is the importance of rebalancing sources of demand in the global economy and maintaining demand in the global economy. I understand the frustration that some countries can have, that Europe, the US, Japan are now in a situation where they are overly reliant on monetary policy to support demand. But I do think it's in the best interests of Korea and other emerging markets for central banks in advanced economies to anchor price expectations and make sure that countries don't get into a deflationary spiral.
Okay, I think maybe Asian countries have some kind of different view because whatever is unconventional and conventional monetary policy, it affects relative prices of their currencies.
Well, so it was certainly unconventional for a country like China to purchase $3.2 trillion in foreign assets to expand its balance sheet. Something like that has never occurred before.
Right. I agree on that too. Okay, The last question, what's the implication of global financial reform and, G20 and on this process, including, macro policy coordination, including currencies and everything, to the emerging economies? Some people say that it's too much focusing on advanced economies and nothing to do with the emerging economies, because for the economics perspective, they need like a global safety net, and they want to have somebody coordinate, foreign exchange policies and sort of stuff. So, what kind of implication G20 and global financial reform to middle income and emerging income economies, in your opinion?
So as global integration of trade and finance increases, and we think it's going to continue to increase in the years ahead, and that's a good thing for global growth and prosperity. But as integration and globalization increases, cooperation and coordination become even more important. And it's even more important that all of the major economic powers, but particularly the new economic powers like Korea, like China, like Brazil, that they have a seat at the table and are involved in decisions on global standards, global rules, and crisis response.
I see. Thank you very much, Mr.
Okay,
Logan. Those are
thank
my
you.
questions.
All right, thanks.